Okay, dear honorable guests, greetings and welcome to our Hidden Treasure Seminar Series, co-organized by Monash University and the Asia Pacific branch of the Ibn Arabi Society. My name is Aydoğan, and I will be having the pleasure to introduce today's seminar on Ibn Arabi, one of the most influential mystics in world history. It's a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Atif Khalil, who is kindly joining us from Canada. Atif Khalil is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Lethbridge, where he has been teaching for more than a decade. His research interests lie in Sufism, Islamic theology and philosophy, Islamic virtue ethics, and comparative mysticism. He is the author of the book Repentance and Return to God, Tawbah in Early Sufism, published by State University of New York in the year 2018. He is the co-editor of the book In Search of the Lost Heart, Explorations in Islamic Thought, also published by State University of New York in the year 2012. And he is the co-editor of the book titled Mysticism and Ethics in Islam, which will be published very soon by American University of Beirut Press. Currently, Professor Khalil is working on two monographs. The first one is on the theory and practice of zikr in Sufism. And the second one is on mystical ethics in Ibn Arabi and Sufism. His more than 24 of articles have appeared in such venues as Philosophy East and West, Studia Islamica, the Oxford Journal of Islamic Studies, and the Journal of the Ibn Arabi Society. And they are all, by the way, available online if you go and check his academia webpage. In the year 2016, Professor Khalid was the Kenan Rifai Visiting Research Professor at the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at the University of Peking or Beijing in China. And at present, he heads the Khan Endowment at the University of Lethbridge to promote the academic study of Islam in southern Alberta. He has studied in Yemen and Syria, and he completed his doctorate at the Center for Religious Studies at the University of Toronto in the year 2009. Professor Khalil's studies pay a unique attention to experiential and ethical concepts, such as humility, gratitude, repentance, spiritual trust, divine remembrance, the heart, and spiritual purification. And his talk today will be similarly focusing on an ethical concept, and it is titled Ibn Arabi on Divine and Human Trusteeship. As usual, after his presentation, we will stop the recording and we will have around 20 minutes for a question and answer session with Professor Khalil. And I will be also leading that session. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Atif Khalil for his exciting presentation. Thank you very much once again, dear Professor, for joining us. And now the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you, Aydoğan, Kars, and Monash University for inviting me to participate in this forum to share with you some of my own research on Ibn Arabi. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Eric Winkle, with whom I read some of the passages from Ibn Arabi that I'll be sharing with you. I'd like to also thank Dr. Hani Ibrahim, who's actually joined us here tonight, as well as Omar Zain, who's part of the Ibn Arabi Society, who also gave me some help with what I'll be sharing with you tonight. Now, at the heart of Ibn Arabi's theological anthropology, that is to say, his understanding of the nature of the human being and the relationship of this nature to God, there stands the idea that he is made in the divine image. As the hadith runs, verily God created Adam in his image. Inna Allaha khalaqa Adama ala surati. However, as a consequence of the fall and the concomitant eclipse of his nature, which is that of a theomorphic being, he cannot help but forget his true self. In this light, the aim of life, of our short sojourn through the terrestrial world of exile, is to remember who we are so that we may once again become who we always were. If not here, then at least after death. Hence the emphasis in Sufism on the practice of dhikr, literally remembrance, an exercise in spiritual anamnesis that sets in motion a transformation of consciousness so that we may begin to see the world as it truly is. And no less importantly, our own place in it. Hence also the emphasis in Sufism on ethical transformation, on tabdil al-akhlaq. Since in order to return to our original primordial self, we must realize our latent splendorous nature, which is that of inabudiyya. Now, since the divine nature in Islam is characterized by certain attributes described in the Quran as the beautiful names of God, al-asma' al-husna, it follows that the self's ethical metamorphosis entails realizing these very divine qualities. But this realization must unfold in a mode commensurate or suitable to that of the human being, since he or she is not a one-to-one replica of God, but a mirror image of him, whose right side becomes our left side, and whose left side becomes our right side. If the axis on which we meet is the pole of divine immanence, the edges on which we part are the extremes of divine transcendence. To put it less opaquely, and in more concrete terms, while there are certain attributes which the classical Sufi authorities of Islam would agree the human being should strive to emulate, such as divine patience, thankfulness, love, forgiveness, compassion, and benevolence, there are others the internalization of which would amount to vices, such as divine lordship, independence, and grandeur. And there are still others over which the classical authorities might even disagree. Should these names, they might ask, only belong to God? Or may they also be assumed by the human being as virtues? Generally speaking, Ibn Arabi takes the immanence or tashbih of God present in man to as far an extent as possible, finding an entry point for the divine names where others would not. But even for Ibn Arabi, these names are never emulated in exactly the same manner in which they belong to God, because there remains a gulf of divine transcendence, otherness, or tanzih, that forever separates the two orders of being, the divine and the human. In other words, just as the world as a macrocosm occupies a place somewhere in between he and not he, so too does the human being as a macrocosm occupy a similar position, with one face turned towards the fullness of God and the other turned towards sheer non-existence. What this means is that the divine names must be cultivated, as already noted, in a fashion which suits our creaturely, ontologically impoverished constitution, but a constitution in which God is nonetheless also mysteriously present, at least in potentia. Now, one of the most well-known and frequently invoked names of God in Islam is Al-Wakil, which literally means the trustee, the agent, guardian, protector, or overseer of affairs. According to the medieval thinker Al-Ghazali, the wakil is, and I quote, the one to whom the affairs are entrusted, وَالْمَوْكُولِ إِلَيْهِ الْأُمُورِ. And in the words of Ahmed Sam'ani in his book, The Repose of Spirits, recently translated by William Chijik, who is another Sufi writer from the same period as Ghazali, wakil means, and I quote, sufficient. It means guardian, and it means guarantor. Some have said that the meaning of wakil is the person to whom you turn over all your work. The Arabs say, I entrusted the affair to so-and-so, so he is my trustee, end of quote. Now this word wakil, it appears in the Quran in 24 instances, often, but not only as a divine name. We encounter it in such verses as, he is over everything a trustee, وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٍ, or sufficient is God as a trustee, وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَكِيلًا. The Quran also instructs the human being to take him as your trustee when it says, فَاتَّخِذْهُ وَكِيلًا. And then there is the verse recited in times of hardship. حَسْبُنَ اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. God suffices us, and he is an excellent trustee. Now, for Muslim authorities, the idea behind divine trusteeship or wakala, of taking God as a trustee, is that we turn over the affairs of our lives to him and let him manage them. It does not imply that we do not strive to put them in order. Rather, it means that we do the best we can and then leave the rest to God, trusting in his oversight of what we place in his hands. This relationship with God as trustee is defined as one of tawakkul, literally trust or reliance, and brings with it a certain measure of freedom from anxiety and restlessness when things do not go our way. To the extent that we hand over the affairs to him, we are entrusters or muwakkils. The act of handing over, commissioning, or entrusting matters to him is in turn that of tawkeel, and the ensuing state of having trust in him once the affairs are handed over makes each and every one of us a mutawakkil. That is to say, a person who has trust in God. Now, all of these terms form a semantic cluster around the verbal root wakala, which means to entrust, assign, or commission. Now, I don't bring up these Arabic words to overburden you with terms from a foreign language, for those of you for whom Arabic is a foreign language, but to draw attention to key elements that form part of the relation of wakala, pivotal to properly understanding Ibn Arabi's doctrine of trusteeship, particularly since he explains this doctrine by employing all of these derivatives of the root wakala to highlight the circular nature of wakala or trusteeship, which we will come to shortly. Now, wakil, as we have seen, is not simply a name of God. It can refer to anyone to whom one's affairs are handed over. In Arabic, wakil may refer to an advocate, defender, or lawyer, insofar as one may assign to them power of attorney. It may also denote in Islamic law one's protective guardian, as well as a person entrusted with one's wealth. Now, in order to better grasp the difference between divine and human trusteeship, between the wakil when he is God and the wakil when he or she is a human being, it is helpful to turn to Ghazali, who in characteristically analytic fashion singles out three factors in his book on the divine names that distinguish the name wakil when predicated of God and when predicated of the human being. He explains, to be precise, the respects in which the name trustee can be attributed to both and where it cannot. By grasping these distinctions, elementary as they are, we are in a better position to understand Ibn Arabi's own meditations on trusteeship and trust in God, on wakala and tawakkul. Now, the first distinction that Ghazali draws attention to, or the first factor that distinguishes human from divine wakala, is that in the case of some people, only, or in the case of human beings rather, only some of the affairs can be entrusted to them, not all of your affairs. So for example, you entrust to your physician matters pertaining to your health, but not your legal issues. You entrust to your teachers matters pertaining to your education, but not your health. You entrust to your accountant matters involving your tax returns, but not your garden, and so on and so forth. And so with human beings, we can only entrust some of our affairs to them, not all of them. But there is another kind of being, namely God, for Ghazali, to whom all of the affairs can be handed over, because such a being has the power and knowledge to oversee all of them. This trustee, as I said, can only be God. So the first distinguishing factor is the scope and the extent to which we can hand over our affairs. With human beings, we only hand over some of our affairs. With God, we hand over all of them. Second, notes Ghazali, there is the trustee to whom matters are turned over through delegation, authorization, and entrustment, even though it is not essential to his nature to have matters handed over. Such a person, in fact, becomes empowered through the entrusting, with his power being entirely contingent on the commissioning act of another. So for example, you are not bound to go to one particular physician when you get sick. You can go to any number of them. You are not bound to one particular accountant to handle your finances. You can go to any number of them. You're not bound to one particular gardener to take care of your lawn. And so this kind of trustee doesn't have an essential relationship of trusteeship with you. There's no essential nature that binds you to this particular trustee. But there's another trustee, says Ghazali, to whom all of our affairs are handed over, since it lies in the essence of this trustee to manage the affairs. And it lies in the nature of this trustee for hearts to incline towards such a trustee. So this second trustee can only be God, for reasons that should be clear. And Ghazali also says that in this particular case, the trustee, the divine trustee, doesn't benefit from us commissioning him as a trustee, whereas human trustees benefit. So you pay your physician, you pay your gardener, you pay your lawyer, and so on and so forth. So the second factor hinges around whether it is in the essential nature of this trustee to be our trustee. With human trustees, it is not the case. With God, it is. And then there is a third factor that distinguishes the human trustees from divine trustees. There is, Ghazali says, the trustee who carries out what is entrusted to him deficiently, prone as he is to fault and failure. So for example, your physician who is a trustee over your health may misdiagnose your sickness or be incapable of curing you. Your gardener who is a trustee over your flowers may not sufficiently water them one summer because it's a dry season. Your accountant may make an error in your tax return, or your dentist may not identify a cavity that's growing at the back of your teeth. So in the first case, you have trustees who are prone to deficiency. But then there is a trustee, says Ghazali, who carries out the trusteeship to perfection without dint or blemish. And this trustee, says Ghazali, can only be God. So the third factor that distinguishes human from divine trusteeship is that with human trustees, the trustee is never carried out to perfection. There's always the possibility of the trustee falling short, but this is never the case with God. Now, these rudimentary distinctions, reflective of Islamic thought in general, form a prism through which we may grasp the distinction between divine and human trusteeship in Sufi ethics. With these preliminary observations, we can now plunge directly into the Meccan revelations to explore how Ibn Arabi understands trusteeship. We shall do this by plunging headfirst into chapter 118, where Ibn Arabi explores the theme of wakala within the context of a discussion of the virtue of tawakkul, reliance on God. Now, near the opening of the chapter, Ibn Arabi states that there are two general views about trusteeship, and by extension, trust in God. These views, as Ibn Arabi says, are not necessarily his own. So we need to be clear about this from the outset. He agrees with them in most respects, but not all. But before we get to the points of divergence, to the extent that we can make these out, let us first try to understand the logic of each of these two views. Now, describing the first view, Ibn Arabi says that, and I quote, "He who observes that the things, excluding the human being, were created for the human being, will find that there is in everything for him that which serves his interests, his maslahah. It, the thing, seeks it, the maslahah, by its very essence. And since he remains ignorant of where lie his interests that are conducive to his felicity, he fears wrongfully exercising authority over those matters. It has been reported that God inspired Moses, O son of Adam, I created the things for you, and I created you for me. Reflecting on this, the person says to himself, if he created things for my sake, and he did not create except that in which my ultimate interests lie, and I am ignorant of the interests through which I may obtain felicity, let me then entrust the affairs to him, for he is more knowledgeable of where my interests lie. Now, this first perspective is rooted in the idea that God created the world for the human being, and he created the human being for himself. Now, since the human being cannot grasp how to completely oversee and manage his own affairs in a manner conducive to his well-being, his ultimate well-being and welfare, in a way that would most securely lead to his salvation and beyond that intimacy with God, he entrusts the affairs to God. After all, says Ibn Arabi, God created them and has a greater right to oversee their management. End of quote. Ibn Arabi says that al-mu'min al-alim, the person of knowledge and faith, therefore takes God as his wakil, or her wakil, and turns over the affairs to him, handing over the reins into his hands. And he does this, as noted, because of his own ignorance of how best to govern what lies under his control. He relinquishes trusteeship and hands it to God. So in this first view, the accent is placed on the trusteeship of God. Elsewhere, Ibn Arabi specifies voicing his own agreement with this view, or parts of this view, that we are no more than ignorant knowers. He says we are ulama al-jahilun. We are people of ignorance and people of knowledge because we only see a sliver of the trajectory that we are on and virtually nothing of what lies beyond it, outside of our immediate terrestrial egocentric field of vision. In effect, says Ibn Arabi, we are blind as we go through life. And this blindness should lead us to let God lead us through allowing him to arrange our life conditions with little intervention, except where it involves engagement in the affairs of religion. In other words, when it involves religion, we should not be passive. We should make sure that we live according to the dictates of prophecy. But with other respects, we take a passive approach. We let God orchestrate our lives, the affairs of our lives. This is the first view. Moreover, this handing over of the reins should be easy because in everything that God has created, says Ibn Arabi, he has created that which leads to our well-being. In this light, it is best to restrain from meddling in the perfection of a cosmic harmony in which we are embedded for purely personal reasons. The logic of this view is easy to appreciate when we consider the imperfections of human wakala, to which Ghazali drew attention as we just saw. And so because of how prone we are to imperfection, when we try to govern our own affairs, we won't do them to perfection in the way that God would. So according to this first view, the first view argues we take a passive approach, we let God take the reins. But then there's a second perspective as well, according to which God did not create the things for us, but for himself, for his own exaltation. Ibn Arabi writes, and I quote, that according to this second view, he created things so that every genus from among the possible things would glorify him in a manner befitting it through prayer and praise. For he says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِ. There's nothing except that it glorifies his praise. It is all for him, Most High, as his dominion. End of quote. Ibn Arabi then explains that according to this view, God placed us in charge, investing us with wakal, making us his wakils, since we are unique in having been made in the divine image. This human deputyship or trusteeship, moreover, is ultimately bound to our status as God's vicegerents on earth, as his khalifas. Khilafa or vicegerency being, from this point of view, a near synonym of wakala or trusteeship. As for the things, while they praise him, they cannot know him, since on the principle that like knows like, only the human being fashioned as a theomorphic image has the capacity to have knowledge of his fashioner. He let down the veils between himself and their perception of him, writes Ibn Arabi. He perceives them, that is the things, while they do not perceive him, since they do not have ma'arifah, or gnosis of God. Gnosis or ma'arifah being the privy of the human being alone who's fashioned in the divine image. But the wakala of God's vicegerents, or the trusteeship of God's khulafa, from this point of view is nevertheless constrained, not absolute, since it is bound to the revealed law. With absolute trusteeship, wakala mutlaqa belonging to God alone. Nevertheless, the human being has been endowed with a certain measure of dominion over the world. And as long as he follows or obeys the boundaries set down by revelation, he fulfills the obligations imposed on him by divine deputyship. And then Ibn Arabi quotes from the Quran, but as for him who transgresses the limits set down by God, he wrongs his own soul. While human history is in many respects a record of these very wrongs, followed by divine retribution or forgiveness, or a combination of both, beginning with the trial and exile of Adam and Eve, our capacity for injustice and sinful rebellion does not negate or nullify our trusteeship, according to this second view, where trusteeship is in the hands of the human being. It is clear from what has been explained that of the two perspectives, the first places the accent squarely on the trusteeship of God, while the second perspective emphasizes the trusteeship of the human being. Regarding the first view, particularly with respect to the trusteeship of God, our mystic draws attention to the extent to which this theme permeates the Quran. And indeed, when we scrutinize Muslim revelation, we find that trusteeship is almost always invariably retraced to God. In the Quran, for example, the Israelites are instructed to, and I quote, "Take not other than me as your trustee." And the Prophet Muhammad is informed on numerous occasions that lasta alayhim biwakil, you are not a trustee over them. And so the first view seems to find more explicit confirmation or corroboration in the Quran, or a basis in the Quran. But the Quran does not explicitly deny the idea of human trusteeship either, especially since it establishes the notion of khilafah quite explicitly, or human vicegerency quite explicitly. In other words, the second perspective is not opposed to the Quran, and in fact finds much of its rationale within the theological anthropology of revelation, evidenced by the development of the idea in the exegetical history of the faith. Where then does Ibn Arabi situate himself with respect to these two conceptions? Well, his own conception, as he states, lies in combining both views. As Ibn Arabi says, for we bring together the 2 points of view, فَنَجْمَعُ بَيْنَ النَّظَرَيْنِ. But this should not come as a surprise, considering the persuasiveness and even rhetorical force with which he presents both perspectives. In fact, when you read Ibn Arabi's explication of both of these perspectives, it's quite confusing, because he explains each perspective with such logical force and rigor that you're convinced that this is Ibn Arabi's position. But then he goes and says, this is the second perspective, and he explains it with such logical force and rigor that you're left a little confused until he says that he combines both views. And then the light dawns. Now, it should be clarified, however, that his own view does not entail an unqualified acceptance of both views. So he digresses or diverges from the proponents of both of these perspectives on certain issues. On the particular question of the teleological function of things, of the ashya, Ibn Arabi highlights his own disagreement when he writes, and I quote, he created the things for himself, not for us. He gave everything its nature. In our nature, khalqina, there is an impoverishment towards what is beneficial for us, wherever it may lie, both with respect to the world and the next. We do not know the way towards that wherein lies our benefit, because he did not create the things for us. So we make him our trustee to subject to us from the things that wherein he knows our benefit to lie. What this means is that as part of God's wakala, he makes subservient to us not so much the things themselves, but only those aspects of the things in which our interests lie. Recall that according to the first view, in everything God created, there lies that which benefits us and leads to our ultimate felicity. This is because, according to this first view, God created the world for us. But since for Ibn Arabi, God created the world for himself, since for Ibn Arabi, God created the things for himself, echoing the proponents of the second view, the things do not in their very essences contain that which is beneficial for us. The trusteeship of God therefore pertains very specifically to guiding us to those matters wherein our own interests lie, and those alone. It involves him subjecting to us not everything, but only those matters that are conducive to our ultimate felicity. Ibn Arabi departs from the advocates of the second perspective, however, in that while they correctly recognize the teleology of things, they fail to appreciate how they relate to our interests, that is to say, to divine wakala. Grasping the precise distinction between the things in and of themselves and those matters that benefit us within the things entails for the mystic treading a narrow isthmus, barzakh daqiq, which according to Ibn Arabi, and I quote, few discern, or to quote Ibn Arabi, few discern. Now, unfortunately, Ibn Arabi does not go into greater detail in how precisely he brings together the two conceptions, each of which retraces trusteeship either primarily to God or to the human being. However, if we return to chapter 558 on the presence of trusteeship, Hadratul Wakala, we form a slightly clearer picture of how they overlap. It is here that Ibn Arabi explores the relationship between the wakil on the one hand and the muwakkil, the one who commissions him, on the other. He gets into the psychology of the relationship now between the entruster and the trustee. The former, he states, is bound to exercise authority only over those matters over which the muwakkil gives him jurisdiction, however wide or narrow in scope they may be. Thus, to quote Ibn Arabi, the wakil, the trustee, does not exercise authority except in that over which he has been given permission. End of quote. But while this confirms upon the muwakkil a certain measure of power over the wakil, since the former defines the limits over which the latter has authority, it also gives the wakil power over the muwakkil, since he has license to execute what the entruster may not desire, due to his own ignorance of how best to manage the affairs. And this is why Ibn Arabi states that, and I quote, "To the wakil belongs the decisive argument, al-hujja al-baligha. If you say to the wakil, the trustee, why did you do such a thing? He will unveil for you the matter so that you will see that it was you who made him do what you disapproved of him doing. It is inevitable that you will disapprove, but he will excuse you and you will excuse him." In other words, since the wakil is only carrying out the task for which he was entrusted, he is blameless. And since the muwakkil is unaware of how to obtain on his own what he entrusted the wakil to help him obtain, it is only natural that he may object to the steps taken by him, necessary in themselves to reach the end for which he was tasked, particularly if those steps become a source of pain for the muwakkil, a possibility acutely recognized by the wakil, whose only hope is the muwakkil exercise patience and tawakkul. Besides, he has no choice in the matter, since he commissioned the wakil to begin with. It is incumbent on the muwakkil, says Ibn Arabi, to obey the wakil, for in doing so, he's not obeying anyone except himself. So think of a painful procedure that a dentist performs on you. You are the muwakkil, you commission the dentist with the task of healing your teeth. And then as a dentist, he has to do things that are painful for you and you grudgingly accept. So that's the complexity, part of the complexity of this relationship. But the wakil only has your interests in mind. The dentist is only doing what you commissioned him to do, and he has or she has your interests in mind. Now, the nature of this dynamic, when transposed onto the divine human plane, because right now we're just talking about interpersonal relations, but Ibn Arabi then transposes this onto the relationship between God and the human being, with the human being as muwakkil and God as the wakil. When we transpose this dynamic onto the divine human plane, it allows us to grasp some of the subtleties that govern the human being's relationship with God as wakil. For one thing, the human being has a measure of agency, in that it is he who commissions as muwakkil God as his trustee. So the human being has power over God, since he makes God his trustee. Ibn Arabi stresses this aspect of human power over God. In addition, the way that our mystic outlines the rules of this relationship implies that the human being may request divine trusteeship over a certain set of specified matters, but not all of them. One may want, for example, God's trusteeship over one's livelihood or health or spiritual direction, but not want God to intervene in our personal relationships since they seem to be going fine. We're happy with where they are. Of course, we may be quite mistaken in how well they're unfolding, but the point is that we may ask for divine intervention or wakala only in certain segments of our life. That is to say, the nafs or lower soul, intent on holding on to whatever pleasure or happiness it has in the moment, may not want the intervention of divine wakala over matters that from its own vantage point seem to be just fine. It's like telling the dentist, okay, take out this tooth, but don't take out the other one. Now, naturally, the ideal for the muwakkil is to entrust all of the affairs to God, particularly if he is serious about his ultimate felicity in posthumous states. And this is, after all, what the Quran summons a person of faith to. But the nature of this relationship, at least in the manner Ibn Arabi outlines it, suggests that the muwakkil has some degree of control in how far she lets God's trusteeship penetrate into his or her life. Theologically speaking, the idea is not that difficult to grasp. A simple illustration of it lies in a prayer that you might make to God, and which God may grant, because God is, after all, Mujib. That's one of the names of God, the answer of prayers. But which God might not have granted if you also invoked him as al-wakil, aware thereby, and where he is aware of the harm that might ensue if he granted the prayer. So if you make a prayer to God and you invoke him as al-mujib, he might give you what you want, even though it's harmful for you. But if you invoke him as al-wakil, the trustee, he might not give you what you want, knowing that it's in your interests not to receive it. And so compassionate silent refusal might be the response when you invoke him as wakil, but not the response if you invoke him as mujib, the answer of petitions. Now, there are two other aspects of divine trusteeship highlighted by Ibn Arabi worth noting before we proceed further. The first of these he brings attention to near the opening of the chapter when he writes, and I quote, "He is the forbearing one, Al-Halim, who does not act in haste. He delays but does not forget, whereas we act in haste, and he knows we act in haste." Divine wakala in this light implies that even though the muwakkil may entrust his affairs to God, that God will only execute the task at the proper time and place. The muwakkil's short-sightedness, however, may lead him to think that the affairs are being neglected, when in truth, the appropriate conditions have not yet materialized. Conditions that might include the entruster's own preparedness to receive or accept the final outcome. In most cases, the perfection and beauty of the divine orchestration of divine trusteeship will only become apparent after death, when the veils are lifted. And so we can't always grasp the perfection of divine trusteeship while we are in the world. Additionally, Ibn Arabi also declares that the intervention of God's trusteeship may be elicited not only by speech in the form of a vocalized prayer, but also through one's state of need or desperation, of a yearning without articulation. As the famous Sufi saying runs, which Ghazali also quotes, "Lisanul hal afsah min lisan al-maqal," that the state is more eloquent than the tongue. One may therefore summon or draw God's trusteeship into one's life simply through a state of desperation and need, of faqr and faqa, with the soul reaching out in helplessness while the tongue remains silent. In either case, once divine wakala is summoned, God now has the argument on his side to do what is required for the muwakkil despite his protests against the steps taken to bring about an outcome for his ultimate welfare. So once you summon God as wakil, whether it's through a state or through a verbal articulation, now God has the argument on his side. He can now manage your affairs and you can't really complain. Now, thus far, we have seen one side of the relationship with God as wakil, or the trustee. The circle of wakala begins to return to its point of origin in the muwakkil, with Ibn Arabi's assertion that as part of God's trusteeship over the human being, God sends his own wakils into the world. And these wakils are the prophets and the messengers, each of whom acts as a wakil of the wakil, a trustee of the trustee, to guide the human race or collectivity of the human race to felicity, which is the teleological end of wakala, or the ultimate teleological end or final end of divine wakala. To quote Ibn Arabi, he entrusted the messengers to convey to the muwakkils, the entrusters, that it lies in your ultimate interests as we see them to do such and such, and to stay away from such and such. For therein lies your felicity and escape from perdition. He who from among the mutawakkils carries out the instructions of the trustee attains felicity and final deliverance. For God says, "O you who believe, respond to God and the messenger when he calls you to that which gives you life." Now, there are a few points that we should clarify from this passage, and with these points I now conclude. First of all, Ibn Arabi describes the human being as a muwakkil, as entruster. This is because he entrusts God with his well-being, making God his trustee so that God can now manage his affairs and bring about his final felicity. So the human being is now the muwakkil, making God the wakil. Second, as part of the trusteeship given to God by the human being, God then entrusts the prophets and the messengers to act as his own wakils, as his own trustees, so that they can direct human beings, will bring about their final end, their final happiness and salvation. Now note, the prophets are not the wakils of the human being, because the Prophet Muhammad is told in the Quran, "Lasta alayhim biwakil," you are not a wakil over them. No, the prophets are the wakil of God, and God is the wakil of the human being. So the human being commissions God with through this act of wakala to become his own trustee, and then God in turn commissions the prophets to act as his own wakils. Third, while Ibn Arabi does not explicitly say this, we can assume so by the logic of his own reasoning, that God's entrusting of the human being with wakala does not end with the prophets and the messengers. To the extent that the ulama, the people of knowledge and sanctity, are the inheritors of the prophets, as the hadith famously states, al-ulama warathatul anbiya, the people of knowledge and sanctity are the inheritors of the prophets. The ulama are the trustees of the trustees of the trustee. So the human being as muwakkil makes God his or her wakil. God then makes the prophets and the messengers his own wakils. And then when the prophets and the messengers depart from the world, the ulama, the people of knowledge and sanctity, the saints, the friends of God, they become the wakils of the prophets and the messengers. Fourth, extending the logic of Ibn Arabi's reasoning even further, and drawing on what he brings up in chapter 118, to the extent that every human being has a responsibility to act as a steward over the earth, as God's Khalifa, as God's vicegerent. Every human being is also a trustee of the trustees of the trustee, a trustee of the prophets who is a trustee of the God. After all, it is through prophecy that we know of the obligation that is imposed on us on khilafah. How do we know that we are vicegerents? Through prophecy. And so khilafah brings with it wakala. Vicegerency, the fact that we are God's vicegerents on earth, also implies that we are trustees. What that means is that every human being who believes in the sacred power and function of trusteeship is simultaneously a muwakkil who entrusts God with the management of his affairs, and also a wakil or trustee to the extent that he is entrusted by God to be a steward over the earth through his prophets, to the extent that he is entrusted by God to govern what lies under his power in accordance with the highest good. Thus, a teacher is a wakil over his students. A mother is a wakil over her children. A physician is a wakil over her patients. A mayor is a wakil over the city, and so on and so forth, with wakala permeating through all levels of society. I began this lecture by noting how for Ibn Arabi, the assumption of the divine names by the human being must correspond to his or her own creaturely, ontologically impoverished nature. While there is a latent divinity within the human center that makes the assumption of the names possible to begin with, that makes takhalluq possible, this takhalluq is entirely contingent and determined by where one is placed by God in life. That is to say, God invests each and every human being with a trusteeship that reflects God's own nature by virtue of the fact that he is wakil, but which also differs from his own wakala, God's own trusteeship, since each person is entrusted with a unique set of responsibilities and set of affairs over which he is granted or she is granted trusteeship by God. Thank you very much.